Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam Sri Radhika pada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasya dattam tam Shri Gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Kotha Mahamrita Payorasho Mudakelato Bande Bhagavatan Iman Anudavam Mṛduni Patyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupari Kripa Krite Yashri Chaitanya Rupo Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surito Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Param Bhojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadana-stṛīṇāṁ dantayar yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Param Bhojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhira Pali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganughami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasada Smaratam Brajandhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Chetasam Me Chittam Satam Marukari Yatu Pada Padme Bhakterya Nikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sokyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Bhaja Yugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Ya Ramya Nikilagha Shanga Shamani Shutra Tritim Sangata Ya Svadhya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Ya Dhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mahita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the fulfiller of his heart's desire, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we'll continue our discussion of Padyavali. And we continue in this explanation of a prayer made for offering, where the poet says, as you, Krishna, took such pleasure in the broken rice offered by Sudama, in the breast milk of Yashoda, in the sweets of the gopis, may you also take pleasure in this offering of mine. So, in the last couple of readings, we were going through a summary of this narration in the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam about Sudama's offering to Krishna. So we'll complete that today, and then we'll probably get into the next subject matter, that of the milk of Mother Yashoda. So, I'll pick up from where we left off last time, and we were discussing the comments given on verses 33 to 37 of chapter 181 in the 10th canto, where Sudama is described to have returned home and saw that his whole home had been transformed into a mansion and he immediately inferred that this could only be Krishna's doing and no other person's doing. So lastly, we heard the explanation given by Chakravartipad that Krishna felt that Sudama had given him something so valuable and had given him such a complete percentage of his own wealth that Krishna really wanted to give him something proportionate in return and something of superior value in return. But he felt that there was nothing that he could give him that was of sufficient value, so he felt shy about his reciprocal gift. So he didn't give it to Sudama face to face, but he just had Sudama find it later because he was feeling shy that giving him a palace as great as Brahma or Indra was all he could present. So Chakravartipad takes it that Krishna felt a little embarrassed about this. So that's where we left off last time. So I'll continue from there. So moreover, he, meaning Krishna, does not feel satisfied just having done that. And so it is said that he considers whatever he gives his bhaktas small, no matter how great it is, and he considers whatever his bhaktas give him superlatively great, no matter how meager it is. He thus feels himself to be a debtor to his bhaktas by virtue of their bhakti. So, such is the power of love. Some warping of the vision occurs, where whatever one gives feels small and whatever one receives feels big. Consequently, Sudama describes Sri Krishna as, quote, he of great nature, Mahatma, meaning he who is possessed of a disposition of compassionateness and so forth that is most worthy of adoration. In other words, that Krishna has such a deep heart that he has this warped vision, if you will. This makes him so worthy of adoration. This is just such a wonderful quality. So even after observing these qualities in Sri Krishna and Sri Krishna's profound affection for himself, Sudama again prays for Sri Krishna's friendship and service. That is, for bhakti to him, as well as for the association of Krishna's bhaktas, because he considers Sri Krishna's gift to him of a palace to be indicative of his own lack of deep understanding. He reasons that had he deeper understanding, Sri Krishna would have blessed him only with firm bhakti and not with worldly opulences. So just as Krishna's vision could be described as a little out of focus, here also Sudama's. In other words, he's given this immense gift by Krishna because his bhakti is so pure, but he interprets it as an indication that his bhakti is not so pure, and that if Krishna had really felt that his bhakti was so firm and pure, Krishna wouldn't have bothered to give him this palace. So the fact that he gave the palace makes him feel that, oh, Krishna might have thought that I wanted this, or that I would be glad to have this. He didn't think that I was completely content just to have bhakti for him. So Sudama perceives it in this way. Regarding Sudama's statement that Bhagavan, quote, sees the fall down of the wealthy caused by conceit, Sri Sanatana and Sri Jiva following him take it that this refers to someone's deviating from their own fixity and falling away from their swadharma and other responsibilities into naraka. So when someone has wealth, they may neglect to show respect to others, to uphold their responsibilities to others. They feel with the power of their wealth, they can provide for themselves, fulfill all their desires just as they are. So it can give rise to this type of conceit. And then if someone neglects their duties, causes disrespects, this can lead to their degradation. So when it is thus understood that possession of wealth leads to conceit and fall down, one may wonder why then Bhagavan bestowed worldly wealth upon great bhaktas like Dhruva Maharaj, Prahlad Maharaj, and Ambarish Maharaj. So Sudama, who, as we heard earlier in Chakravartipad's comment, had in his mentality a stiff form of aversion to worldly things. So Sudama's remark that wealth is just the cause of conceit, it's just the cause of fall down, this is his analysis, and that's not untrue. There are many people who become conceited and degraded as a result of having wealth, but not entirely just because of the wealth. So Jiva Goswami is now raising this point. If we take what Sudama says full stop and apply it to everyone, then you would think, okay, then wealth equals conceit and fall down. So to give someone wealth would mean to give them the cause of conceit and fall down. So, Bhagavan has given wealth to very great bhaktas, so does Bhagavan give them the cause of conceit and fall down? Why would Bhagavan do that? So is it really always and necessarily a cause of conceit and fall down? So thus, Jiva Goswami gives this analysis. Sri Jivapad, following Sri Sanatanpad, addresses this by explaining that Sudama's mention of a bhakta's, quote, lacking deep understanding indicates that worldly wealth will not lead to conceit and fall down in the case of those who have deep understanding, because the emergence of conceit and a fall down as a result of it will be preempted by the strength of such bhaktas' personal discernment. So, in other words, there's another factor here. In other words, wealth can create a ripe circumstance for conceit and fall down, but whether someone actually will end up in conceit and fall down depends on the degree of their vivek, the degree of their discernment. So if their discernment is strong, or if they're, quote, of deep understanding, then they won't fall down. So in the case of Bhagavan giving wealth to Dhruva Maharaj, Prahlad Maharaj, Ambarish Maharaj, or here to Sudama, the idea is that he has confidence in the strength of their vivek. He trusts the purity of their bhakti and knows that even though wealth can create these type of susceptibilities, it also creates other utilities. And in the case of the lives of these particular bhaktas who he gave this wealth to, he felt that those utilities were more valuable than the contingencies that came along with them. So in the case of some, he considers, nope, the contingencies are greater than the utilities. Better this bhakta not have wealth, lest they become conceited and neglect their practice or commit aparad or what have you. But in the case of those with sufficient vivek, sufficient purity of heart, then there's no such concern. So, Sudama, in humility, however, considers that Bhagavan gave him worldly wealth even though he is devoid of deep understanding, because Bhagavan perceived him to be obstinate in his material attachment. So in other words, Sudama thinks, Krishna gave me this because he thought I was attached to it. So Chakravartipad portrays Sudama's personal reflection in this regard as follows. Quote, in general, Bhagavan does not grant riches, like a treasury, a kingdom, that is sovereignty, or assets, that is a wife, and so on, to someone lacking deep understanding. Also, in the case that he granted riches to persons of deep understanding, that is, to bhaktas like Prahlad, there was no harm to them. Only because of the absence of bhakti on the part of I who lack deep understanding, I received wealth from Bhagavan. So in other words, in Chakravartipad's view, Sudama understands that wealth can't unseat bhakti from someone in whom bhakti is sufficiently implanted or sufficiently, strong within their heart and mind. But it can lead to problems for those in whom it's not. So then Bhagavan wouldn't give wealth to them. So Bhagavan gave wealth to me, Sudama's thinking. So does that mean he thinks that I have the purity and the depth of understanding that's required to not be negatively influenced by it? No. Sudama, in his humility, doesn't think that he's sufficiently deep to not be unswayed by it. He thinks, no, I'm actually even lower than the bhaktas who can be influenced by the presence of wealth. I'm just someone who lacks that understanding and who lacks bhakti and who's just attached to these things. So Bhagavan just gave me what I wanted. So he, in his humility, interprets it like this. Therefore, enough with this. In other words, therefore he doesn't take a liking to it, or he doesn't revel in the presence of these things. Rather, reflecting thus, Sudama engaged in enjoyment of objects of the senses only to the extent conducive. Lied, that is, slept on the ground, sustained fixity in rites related to Bhagavan, and was possessed of paramount intentness upon hearing, praising, and so on, that is, in various other acts of bhakti to Bhagavan. This is to be understood. So in other words, although Sudama received all of this, he didn't slacken in his bhakti at all. Rather, he felt that he received it only because of a lack of bhakti, and thus he continued with strong resolve to try to sustain his bhakti. So here it says, engaged in objects of the senses, enjoyment of objects of the senses only to the extent conducive. So we hear a similar remark in the Charitamrita when Mahaprabhu is advising Das Goswamipad early on, when Das Goswamipad comes to him, then he says, Yatha yunja vishaya bhoganasakta hoya. That no, go home and engage in vishaya bhog, being detached. Or in other words, go on with, conventional means of eating and sleeping and, conducting your worldly affairs, but don't be attached to it. So Das Goswamipad has later in the history of our Sampradaya become famous as one of the most, extreme renunciates. But it's noteworthy that here in the beginning of his journey, he was advised Mahaprabhu not to engage in renunciation. He was ready to renounce, and Mahaprabhu is saying, no, go home, stay there, and carry on with those very same things. So this is a very important lesson, that by remaining in the midst of those things and doing so in a manner with detachment and with fixity upon absorption in bhakti, that is what will actually deepen the sanskar for bhakti, such that one will really become so detached from those things that one can remain tranquil and strong and joyful and steady in their absorption in bhakti even without them. So if one tries to go without them, without that sufficient degree of purity of mind, without that sufficient degree of absorption in bhakti, without that sufficient extent of actual fulfilling experience of bhakti, then it won't work right. And they'll either end up going back to it, or they'll end up compensating it by using aspects of Vaishnava culture to fulfill those same purposes. In other words, they'll engage in the pursuit of sense enjoyment and wealth and pratishtha and so forth, using the trappings of being a Vaishnava, or the premises or the pretexts of elements of Vaishnava culture to do so. So here, this way that Sudama went about this practice, or the way that Das Goswamipad went about this practice, is important to consider. And for the majority of people, especially in today's society where common people live with conveniences that even kings never enjoyed in the past, we as a population have become quite habituated to high standards of creature comforts and things like that. So to take ourselves a little serious, in other words, to recognize how habituated the vast majority of people are to all sorts of conveniences, and to not think, oh, then that means we're nowhere on the path of bhakti, but rather to say that if we can remain in the midst of those things, but continue the practice of bhakti without being excessively preoccupied with them, that really is a viable strategy, if you will, or a viable approach to the path. So Sudama, here, he's in the midst of, wealth like the devas, but he's just, to the extent required, to that extent means he's not overeating, he's not indulging in things that are unnecessary, and he's very intent upon his Shravan, Kirtan, etc. Riches and so on do not cause an increase in making a bhakta happy, but rather increase that just slightly for the sake of bringing about the attainment of the service to Bhagavan with prema desired by them. So this is also a nice point. Even in conventional life, people widely say, money can't buy you happiness, or, can't buy me love, as I think the Beatles wrote. So people understand that the more money you have, the more peace you feel, or the more satisfaction you feel, or the more love that you have. There's no such correlation or no such causation. But it is widely recognized that a certain basic amount of wealth does increase, someone's happiness minimally or marginally. In other words, to be in a state of abject poverty, stress, or subject to difficulties that one can't alleviate because they lack sufficient wealth to do so, that cause acute disturbance in their life, to acquire enough wealth in order to manage those elements, that does increase people's satisfaction, or that in the conventional worldly sense. And then here, according to this comment, that when a bhakta has enough wealth whereby they can go about the practice of bhakti that they aspire to do, then marginally that amount of wealth does bring, or is a part, or a material cause of the happiness that they feel. But only that much, in other words. But beyond that, it's really only the quality of the bhakti that they practice, or the depth of their own experience and absorption in their practice of bhakti that really is what matters to a bhakta. So in that sense, the, quote, happiness brought by wealth is only marginal and only secondary, in that it's entirely dependent upon the utilization of it in what is of central and utmost interest to the bhakta, namely their sadhana bhakti. And in the case of Sudama, his prema bhakti. In other words, Sudama, that he had sufficient wealth to absorb himself completely in his prema bhakti, that much he was glad about. He didn't need any more than whatever would have been necessary to have such absorption, and he certainly had more than was required, but he accepted it because Krishna gave it to him, but really his joy was entirely in prema bhakti. So this point of Chakravarti Pad, that, by adding that, riches and so on do not completely cause an increase in making a bhakta happy. In other words, on their own or entirely, just getting wealth doesn't do anything for a bhakta. But just slightly, for the sake of bringing about attainment of the service with prema they desire. In other words, but ishat matram vardayati, that wealth does help a little. So this is sometimes in the name of vairagya, or in the name of, being against, pointing out all the defects of wealth from the 11th canto. We can speak very, harshly or very dismissively of wealth as, the root of all evil and this kind of thing. But here, it's nice that the Chakravarti Pad is giving a balanced view and saying, ishat matram, just a little. There's a little utility to that. So to overstate that is a problem, but to completely deny that would also be undue. So kudos to Chakravarti Pad for always, bringing out these balance points. So the point he made earlier, that Bhagavan does give wealth to bhaktas whom it won't affect, and even in the case of bhaktas who it might affect, there can be, some marginal utility or appreciative value of that, entirely contingent upon that bhakta's appreciation for bhakti or absorption in bhakti. Okay, point is clear, I think. So, Sri Sukadev Goswami Pad concludes his narration related to Sudama in Srimad Bhagavatam as follows. So finally, Sudama says, or Shukadeva summarizes, Itam vyavasito buddhya bhakto tiba janardane vishayan jayaya tyakshan bhubudhe nattilam pataha evam savipro bhagavat suhritada drishtva sabrityair ajitam parajitam tadhyana vegod gratitatma bandhanas tadhamalebhe chirata satam gatim. Thus resolute in understanding, this great bhakta of Janardana, relinquishing these objects of the senses bestowed upon him by Bhagavan Sri Krishna, enjoyed them for the sake of his wife without being excessively covetous of them. In this way, then observing the unconquerable one, namely Bhagavan Sri Krishna, becoming conquered by his own servants, this Brahmana, a friend of Bhagavan, became unloosed from bondage of the self by means of a stream of meditation upon him, and soon attained his abode, the shelter of the Sat. So, by saying, quote, relinquishing these objects of the senses, and then saying also that he enjoyed them, it refers back to what was mentioned earlier when the idea of partaking of them, but at the same time being detached from them, and not being excessively covetous of them. So achieving this balance in the presence of these elements is really a strength, so to speak. There's, many stories in Vaishnava lore as well as yogic lore about, the sadhu who goes off to the mountain cave and absorbs himself in isolation and meditation for a prolonged period and is considered by himself and by others to be very deeply accomplished in his practice, and then decides to return to, come out of that isolated state. And then upon doing so, suddenly all that what was going on readily in isolation, disintegrates, and attachments and emotions and so many things come back up once they're back in a socially responsible and exposed context to other things of the world. So there's to develop the strength to remain detached, to develop the strength to remain not excessively desirous. In other words, to develop the strength to remain balanced and absorbed in one's practice, not just hidden away and fully isolated from these things, but even within marginal, let's call it marginal proximity to them. In other words, that doesn't mean we need to, put them, actively bring them around us to an excessive or an extent which makes it unnecessarily difficult. But some exposure as well will actually strengthen the depth of the practitioner's absorption. There's one analogy can be given like if you're growing plants that might be sensitive to frost and you're trying to start them early, then you might start them off in the greenhouse and then later plant them outside in the field. And there's a process whereby the plant, if you have it in the greenhouse for a long time and then one day you just take it out and plant it in the field, that sudden shift between the two atmospheres can be difficult and the plant can die. So they have processes whereby the plants are kept in the greenhouse, but then the greenhouse is left open for a few days, so it gradually gets exposed to the colder temperatures, which is in agricultural talk called hardening them off. And in other words, giving them by being exposed gradually, they acquire the resilience to sustain the difference in temperature. So something like that, if someone's practice can, gradually grow in its strength by not being excessively exposed to these things, but not being completely isolated from them either, such that the resilience of their detachment and their absorption can continue to grow stronger without getting excessively pressured such that it recedes, then this will lead to something solid. So something like this we can derive in terms of any sort of practical application from this kind of analysis. So Sudama is neither excessively attached, neither excessively covetous, yet also, partaking of these things. So he's succeeding in maintaining this balance. And as such, he's contemplating how loving, how wonderful Krishna is in that he gives of himself, he reciprocates with his bhaktas to such a profound extent. And so sitting in the midst of these things, yet being detached from them, and carried away in his meditation on Krishna's love, on Krishna's affection for him, on the richness of his relationship with Krishna, he soon, in other words, time passes, he passes on from this world and he reaches Krishna's abode. So Sri Samipad comments in this regard that relinquishing means gradually practicing relinquishment. Sri Jivapad takes this to mean that Sudama would think, today or tomorrow I will relinquish these objects. So the idea being that to practice or to engage with them with detachment is this idea that, okay, I'm interacting with them, but not forever, or not in an increasing manner, but in a way that it doesn't increase and may gradually decrease. So this also parallels the famous statements in the 11th canto where Krishna speaks to the person who can't give up the objects of desire by saying, Jushamanas chatan kaman duko darkangs chagarhayan. That in that situation, go on experiencing them, but also cultivate the awareness of their effects. In other words, observe the whole cycle, observe the whole process, observe how there's a pleasure experience from them and there's also a pain created by them. And then with that, vivek and that observational awareness, then gradually the samskar for those things can wane, and side by side the samskar for bhakti can deepen. So something like that, to hear, if we bring that teaching and juxtapose it with this one, by saying, okay, I'm going on, but with the idea that I'm unwinding, with the idea that this is, scaling down. This is, in the most case, if we take it out of reference to Sudama and speak of it as a teaching in general, this is a realistic approach for the vast majority of people. To just, try to say, oh, okay, it's over, or oh, I'm completely finished with it. That may not be realistic for many people, but if they can even foster this sense of, okay, it's continuing, but it's with the idea that it's temporary, that itself will change the experience and one's attitude toward it, and thus the way that the psyche becomes influenced by the process. Anyway, Sri Jivapad also comments that Sudama's, quote, understanding refers to his understanding of these objects being the grace of Bhagavan, and that his not being excessively covetous of them means he was detached from these objects as he enjoyed them. So this is the same point that I was just referring to from that verse in the 11th canto, to partake of them or, quote, enjoy them, but at the same time have a sense of detachment from them. In other words, to recognize that the pleasure produced by sense experience is not genuine pleasure, it's not any sort of ultimate state of fulfillment, and just perpetually trying to run from one mind-absorbing pleasure to another in an endless stream of desirable sense objects isn't actually happiness, isn't actually the fulfillment of life. Although it does do great for modern, resource extraction economies. If you can program society to become like that, that will enable you to really efficiently destroy the environment on the earth by constantly, convincing people that there's a justification to extract all these resources and pollute all these places just to provide these things that people actually don't need. But as soon as you convince them that they actually do, then blast. So anyway, I don't mean to go off topic here, but rather than this idea that the constant state of temporary sensual pleasures is actual happiness, to understand that this isn't actual enjoyment or isn't actual happiness, but there is some sort of sensation or satisfaction temporarily felt by sense objects, and so to go on experiencing them, but also cultivating that awareness, that sense of detachment from them, that resolve towards a genuine and deeper sense of happiness, namely that found in bhakti, that found in bringing satisfaction to Bhagavan, idealizing that one's pleasure shall come from his pleasure, what is called tat sukha sukhitva. This will be, how the samskar for bhakti becomes more deeply embedded in the psyche, and then gradually even that the perceived significance or satisfaction of those sense pleasures will reduce along the way. So to be not excessively covetous and detached while also, quote-unquote, enjoying them. And also the point made to recognize them as Bhagavan's grace. In other words, to see that, to take the mood that these are things that are to be treated with respect, that they're also part of one's relationship with Bhagavan, that everything that comes to one's life is part of the unfolding of that relationship and is to be treated with due respect accordingly. That cultivation of that attitude of regard and perception of things as grace upon one is not the mentality of these are things that I can enjoy and then throw away and all of this kind of thing, but rather everything is part of my relationship with Bhagavan, can be perceived as something coming to me from him, and I should respect that, I should honor that appropriately in a way that facilitates bhakti to him and not, quote-unquote, separate satisfaction or, feeling pleasures that have nothing to do with his pleasure, and on top of that, which might, cause all sorts of problems for the immediate environment or community that I exist within. So in other words, I'm sorry if this is a proper, way to pull this phrase out, but, at least in the US, sometimes you see these billboards that try to tell people to, quote, drink responsibly. But you might be able to boil this down in a very different sense than that, to, quote unquote, enjoy responsibly. Meaning, see it as Bhagavan's grace, don't be excessively covetous of it, go about it with the engagement of the vivek, and see it as fuel or support for one's absorption in bhakti and the pursuit of his pleasure. By all of these things, then that tendency towards completely self-centered sense enjoyment, which is just has nothing to do with bhakti or Bhagavan, the whole tendency or ingrained approach in the psyche towards that can be gradually brought down. So anyway, sorry for the excessive elaboration. Further, the meditation upon Bhagavan, which Sudama would become absorbed in, whereby he became freed from, quote, bondage of the self, that is, from all varieties of pride, such as that of being a brāhmana, was that of loving thought of how Sri Bhagavan becomes captivated by his bhaktas by means of bhakti. Aha. So bhakta vatsalya, or bhakti vashyata, that Bhagavan has such affection for bhaktas, that bhakti is so captivating to Bhagavan, when one contemplates this, then one's own conceits can be curbed. So he's taking, quote, atma here in the sense of conceit, or, the bondage of self in quotes, of self, in other words, who I think I am, my own ego construct of being, in this case of Sudama, a Brahmin who has certain dignity and is meant to be shown certain respect in society. This can also be a type of, while being a brahmana has many advantages, but being in that role of being someone to whom charity is given, to whom respect is meant to be shown, these also leave one susceptible to varieties of pride, of conceit, of and other, challenges. So he heals himself, or he goes through the process of becoming free from those subtle taints. And what was it that really did that? It's noteworthy, right, that the meditation upon Bhagavan is what did that. So just by being renounced or just by being detached, that doesn't necessarily curb you of pride, because even detachment can be a cause of one's pride. There's no shortage of persons who can be, great vairagis, but very, very, proud of the fact that they're so successful of living without so many of the comforts or the facilities that others do. And then, in one sense, that pride becomes the bondage and the perpetuation of their samskar. And the whole purpose of the vairagya was supposedly the transcendence of the samsara, but actually that thing that's meant to be a means towards transcendence itself turns into a perpetuation of bondage. So to preclude that, or to come out from those psychological pitfalls, what really works, so to speak, is meditating on how loving Krishna is, or how much Krishna reciprocates with bhaktas, how much he's captivated by bhakti. To contemplate that lovingness is, in other words, love is what will bring love to you and heal your pride. So, manage your external dealings with the environment according to the principles that we've discussed, but mainly meditate on Krishna, meditate on his love, his care, the beauty of bhakti, the richness of bhakti, of relation, and that will heal all of the psychological things, which really are far more of a cause of bondage than, the volume of how much you eat for breakfast, or, what are the exact ingredients in your lunch, or all of these kind of things. So, just to recap, the verse itself said that observing the unconquerable one becoming conquered by his own servants, this brahmana became unloosed from bondage of the self by means of a stream of meditation upon him, and soon attained his abode. So, this was a glossing of what is that, quote, stream of meditation. Now, one little addendum, or parishishta as it's called here. This narration in Srimad Bhagavatam of Bhagavan Sri Krishna delighting in, quote, the palmful of broken flat rice from your friend, thus serves to illustrate the extent to which Sri Bhagavan is pleased by desireless or nishkama bhakti. Another narration that parallels this narration about Sudama in Srimad Bhagavatam can be found in Chaitanya Bhagavat in regard to another poor brahmana named Shuklambar Brahmachari. So we see a Gora Leela parallel, if you will, to this Leela of Krishna in Sudama. So I've elected to include the passage of the Chaitanya Bhagavat here. It's quite a long passage, so I think I'll just omit reading the Bengali of it, but I'll just highlight a couple of the nice phrases that come that give the gist of the teaching from it at the end. So, here we go. Please hear some discussion of this Shuklambar. His residence was in Navadip, where Prabhu's birth occurred. He was greatly devoted to his Swadharma and greatly tranquil. No one could recognize that he was a great Mahanta or Bhakta. So by Swadharma here, you would mean he carefully observed the conduct of a Brahmana. He begged alms, he lived in simplicity, like that. And mainly, he's a Bhakta. Carrying a cloth satchel over his shoulder, he begged alms from house to house in Navadip. Day and night he would cry, calling out, Krishna. Considering him a beggar, people did not recognize him. In other words, that he was a person of profound character, of great honorability. They had no such recognition. They thought he's a poor person. They didn't show much respect or attention to him. His poverty was to the extent that he wandered about for alms. After begging alms during the day, the brahmana would make an offering to Krishna with what he received and then accept the remnants. In the tranquility he felt from the bliss of Krishna, he did not know poverty. That is, he did not feel any misery because of his poverty. In other words, he is feeling the joy of bhakti, and that was so strong that the difficulties of his poverty didn't bother him. He would go out to every house saying, Krishna, who can recognize a recipient of Chaitanya's grace? Who Chaitanya graces can when Chaitanya does so. As the poor Damodar, that is Sudama, who is sometimes referred to as Damodar, previously, so was the bearer of bhakti to Vishnu named Shuklambar. So, in other words, Shuklambar was just like Sudama. And so too was the grace of Vishwambar bestowed upon Shuklambar, who would remain inside the house of Srivas Thakur during Prabhu's dancing. So as Krishna bestowed great grace and had great affection for Sudama, so too Mahaprabhu had great affection and gave great grace to this Shuklambar. Once upon a time, when Vishwambara was seated at his home in the company of various bhaktas, the brahmana, holding his cloth satchel over his shoulder, danced in merriment upon arriving. Seeing this, Prabhu smiled with all the Vaishnavas. So this is a charming sight. In other words, people are sitting around and someone, comes in dancing, and on top of that, he's a very poor Brahmin. So to see someone who is in a social circumstance where expressions of great joy might be quite rare, to see the person, feeling great joy even in the midst of that, this is especially endearing. So Mahaprabhu is glad to observe Shuklambar in this respect. And so he states the following. Okay, where was I? Seeing this, Prabhu smiled along with all the Vaishnavas. Prabhu was sitting in a state of absorption in being Ishvara. That is, he was cognizant of his being Bhagavan at this time. Shuklambar danced, cried, and laughed with his cloth satchel over his shoulder. So he's just, going on very merrily. And after observing Shuklambar, gracious Gauranga graciously said, Come, come! You have been a poor servant of mine birth after birth. Giving everything to me, you observe the conduct of a mendicant. I always desire items from you. Even if you do not offer them to me, I forcibly take and eat them. In Dwaraka, I snatched away and ate your broken bits of rice. Did you forget about that? Kamala caught hold of my hand to stop me from eating more. So we've heard this whole narration in the last class. Saying this, Vishwambar took palmfuls of rice from inside the cloth satchel of Shuklambar with his hand and began chewing them. Shuklambar said, Prabhu, you have created a disaster. There are numerous broken bits in this rice. Prabhu replied, I eat broken bits of rice from you, but I do not even look back at nectar from a non-bhakta, much less would I ever consume it. So you can see this remark directly parallels the statement from the reading we had last time of Krishna, where, the dialogue here is mirroring precisely the dialogue in the Bhagavatam. he who is independent, who is supreme bliss personified, and is the life of bhaktas, chews on uncooked rice from his bhakta. Who can stop him from doing so? Seeing Prabhu's grace, all the bhaktas put their hands on their heads and wept. So, in the sense of, amazement, and we do not know who fell in which direction while weeping. Everyone became overwhelmed seeing the grace of Prabhu upon Shuklambar. Great bliss as well as kirtan of Krishna arose, and everyone present, starting from the children and elderly, wept. Someone put straw between their teeth. Someone offered obeisance. Someone said, Prabhu, please never leave me. The fortunate Shuklambar rolled on the ground as Ishvara of Vaikuntha happily ate the rice. Prabhu said, listen, Shuklambar Brahmachari, I dwell always within your heart. When you eat, my eating occurs. When you go out for alms, my roaming about occurs. My avatar is to distribute prema bhakti, and you are my beloved servant, birth after birth. I have given you the gift of prema bhakti, and now for certain that prema bhakti is my vital air, or my prana. So in other words, bhakti is Bhagavan's pran. Bhagavan lives, his life breath is that prema. Hearing this boon upon Shuklambar, the circle of Vaishnavas all chanted, Jai, Jai, Hari. A servant of Lakshmi's Lord begs from house to house. What greatly fortunate person understands the essence of this rasa? So this is the classical point that Shiv Thakur is a renunciate, but his bhaktas are typically wealthy. Vishnu lives in the grand palace of Vaikuntha, but his bhaktas are typically poor. So, Lakshmi's Lord Gaurachandra forcibly eats this rice from this Brahmana receives after begging from 10 houses. He who is a reservoir of qualities has personally, in the form of the Vedas, described the procedure for making offerings with mudras. And without observance of that procedure, in accord with the injunctions of the Vedas, he does not accept anything. But, by way of bhaktas, all such resolutions made in the Vedas are broken. In other words, there's such elaborate, difficult to perform yagyas with precise pronunciation of mantras and highly detailed rituals, and only by executing everything according to the ritual procedure precisely will the offering be accepted and successful. So, such the opposite extreme. Here the bhakta, he's not even offering something that's unofferable, and Bhagavan is taking it by force and eating it. So this point we also came out earlier when we mentioned that verse about Braja's cows, where Brahma in his stuv in the 10th canto is saying that, Prabhu, you've taken the form of these calves and these cowherd boys, and you're drinking this breast milk and you're drinking this udder milk, and yet, you're whom all the Vedas and all the yagyas are, designed to try to please and make offerings to. So Brahma is just spellbound by this, that even though Bhagavan manifested the Vedas and all of these ritual procedures and elaborate means by which sacrifice is to be offered to him, he goes and from bhaktas, he relishes things like this. So this is something bhaktas marvel about. This is the content of that stream of Sudama's meditation. So, by way of the bhaktas, all such resolutions are broken. Shuklambar's rice is evidence of this. Therefore, bhakti is the vital air or prana of all injunctions. So here's a very nice statement in the Chaitanya Bhagavat. coming with the gist of it. Sakala vidhir bhakti pran. That bhakti is the pran, bhakti is the vitality of all the injunctions, of all the rules. In other words, if someone following the rules makes an offering, the real life of that is the bhakti being expressed through that performance of or adherence to the injunctions, not the actual obedience to the injunctions or the act the injunction enjoins itself. So, all injunctions and prohibitions are servants of bhakti. One who feels misery because of this has lost their intelligence. So who would feel miserable to hear this? Well, frankly, most of the non-Vaishnava brāhmaṇas. In other words, those who put a high premium on the rituals found in the karma marg and who don't take to the bhakti path. If you come along and tell them, bhakti is the pran of all these things you do, without bhakti it's all lifeless, and Bhagavan isn't really interested, and Bhagavan is pleased with us even if we don't do any of all these elaborate things that you do, then those who are of that mentality won't like to hear that. They're not going to be so glad to hear that. But bhaktas rejoice. Sudama rejoices. All the bhaktas here with Mahaprabhu are shedding tears to hear these remarks. So, Vedavyas has said that the basis of injunctions is bhakti, and Gauranga has shown this directly. This Brahmana did not make any mudras. He did not even personally offer the rice. Still, Prabhu ate the rice eagerly. All who are blinded by inebriation from objects of the senses do not understand this essence. Because of the inebriation of children, wealth, and family, they do not recognize a Vaishnava. The worship and wealth of one who laughs upon seeing a foolish or poor person of virtue, that is, a poor or foolish Vaishnava, never appeals to Krishna. It is said in the 4th canto, quote, the connoisseur of rasa, Hari, he to whom those who have no worldly wealth and whose wealth is the self, namely Hari himself, are dear, does not accept the worship of those of polluted intellect, who because of the inebriations of learning, wealth, family, and deeds, engage in wrongdoing in relation to the divested, that is, detached and possessionless sadhus. In other words, persons who don't show respect to Vaishnavas because they're poor, or because they're not highly educated, or because they don't have any big standing in society. Bhagavan doesn't like that. Bhagavan doesn't accept the puja of those people. Why? All the Vedas sing of Krishna as akinchana pran, he who is the vital air of the divested. In other words, those people who let go of all the things of the world because of their holding on to him, Krishna is the life of them. He holds them as being his immense wealth. In other words, by their letting go of worldly wealth, Krishna holds them as his wealth. And he's, holds them so dear, or is so with them, that he's like their very prana. Gauranga showed this to him, meaning Shuklambar, directly. One who hears of Chaitanya's eating Shuklambar's rice attains prema bhakti to Chaitanya's feet. Gaura Haribo, Gaura Haribo. Okay. As in the case of Sudama, so in the case of Shuklambar, Sri Bhagavan took immense pleasure, not even in some meager food offered to him by a dear bhakta, but even in food that was neither actually even offered to him, nor fit to be offered to him. These leelas thus vividly illustrate that Sri Bhagavan is so greatly satisfied just by bhakti, because of it, he becomes eagerly inclined to partake even of items that are not fit to be offered, and at will partakes of them by force, so as to relish as far as possible his bhakta's bhakti to him. So this is, quote, the pleasure taken by Krishna in the offering of rice from a friend that we heard about in the verse we're discussing. So I'll leave it at that for today. And if anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or feedback of any other type, please feel free. Yes.
Pranam Baba, thank you for the presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, Pranam.
So I think you answered my question, but I'm going to ask it. I want to understand the main point in this Leela of Sudama Vipra. Did he attain? So what's being the focus here in this Leela, in these passages that you've read, is that he, it is his, what's being highlighted is his devotion to Bhagavan. That is, basically, it's the effect of his bhakti that has caused this renunciation, or is it his ability to distance himself from the enjoyment, basically his vivek, to stay away from these cycles of, this attachment to material enjoyment? So is the highlight the bhakti portion, or his ability, his use of vivek, or both?
Both. In that, you could say, in the case of a follower of the path of bhakti, bhakti has the effect of chitta shuddhi, of purifying the mind of other desires and attachments. So to the extent that one engages in the purifying practices of bhakti, to that extent one's vivek will work all the more vividly and effectively. Because in the case of many, it's not that many people don't have vivek, but it's that that capacity for discernment or for discrimination gets carried on or gets pulled by various desires that people have. So as bhakti purifies the chitta of other desires, then the strength of one's vivek to work in the interest of bhakti, so to speak, becomes all the more effective. So there, you could say two parts of the same engine, or there are two aspects of one process. In the case of a person following the path of bhakti, obviously there's the use of vivek on the path of gyan, or in other contexts where the matter is a little different. In other words, where there's an attempt to use the strength of vivek alone. So in the case of bhakti, there's obviously bhakti is the centrality of the path, but then there's the application of the vivek in service to the ideal of bhakti, and the support that the faculty of vivek gets from the influence of the practice of bhakti.
Yes, and thank you. And both would you say that of course I understand that for bhakti, bhakti comes from bhakti, so we need kripa for that aspect, but for the vivek, one can just acquire vivek and use kripa wouldn't necessarily be necessary, correct? Or would we need it for both?
Well, the main thing vivek needs is education. And, the teaching that we get, to guide how the vivek is applied, we can say that all of that teaching is itself a manifestation of kripa. It's the kindness of Bhagavan to give the teachings he's given in the Bhagavatam and other texts, and it's the kindness of gurus and Vaishnavas to teach these things and discuss these things and help us understand these things. So in that sense, you can say that the vivek is highly reliant on grace in the form of having heard and having learning what is the path of bhakti and how to follow it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right, well, I think we can call it at that for today, if that's all that anyone has. So we didn't make it to discussion of Mother Yashoda, so we can dive into that next time. And this time we'll happily conclude with this remembrance of both Sudama Vipra as well as Shuklambar Brahmachari and the immense affection for bhaktas that Bhagavan shown in the case of these persons, and also the extent to which these bhaktas were so fulfilled by their bhakti that they had such detachment from all else. So, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai Radha.